Istanbul, Turkey's largest city and seaport, is one of the world's most iconic cities. The old city is lodged between two continents, Europe and Asia. Along the Bosphorus Strait, Istanbul boasts of breathtaking beauty, with landmarks like the Hagia Sophia and Blue Mosque. But what no one expected was just how fragile the city truly was. In the space of just 13 seconds, Istanbul's proud skyline cracked at the seams, exposing weaknesses that had been hidden for decades. Today, we're digging into why the 2025 earthquake was far worse than anyone feared, and what could have been done to stop it. By the way, if you like investigative-style content like this, leave a like and subscribe too, so you never miss a video. Now, away from you and back to Istanbul. You see, with its 16 million inhabitants, Istanbul is a city of contrasts. Why? It's in the middle of two continents, Europe and Asia. So here, in the city anciently known as Constantinople, tradition meets innovation, and civilization meets one of nature's very few defects, the North Anatolian Fault. The North Anatolian Fault is a 1,500-kilometer-long strike-slip fault, a lot like California's San Andreas Fault, that stretches from the junction with the East Anatolian Fault in eastern Turkey all the way across northern Turkey and into the Aegean Sea. So now we've got another fault in eastern Turkey. However, it is that one in northern Turkey that has always bothered geologists. It passes within 20 kilometers of Istanbul, through the Sea of Marmara. Historically, that fault has led to several disastrous earthquakes, including a 7.6 magnitude quake that struck the nearby city of Izmit in 1999. Just 90 kilometers away from Istanbul, 17,000 people lost their lives, and another estimated 500,000 others were displaced. The shockwaves rocked across Istanbul, and experts have been sounding the alarm ever since. Still, Istanbul continued to grow, rapidly, maybe even chaotically. Skyscrapers and apartment blocks rose alongside ancient mosques and palaces, but beneath the city's stunning skyline lay a hidden danger. Thousands of buildings, many of them built before modern seismic codes were put in place, were vulnerable to collapse. And on that fateful Wednesday, it all came crashing down. Every 23rd of April in Turkey is National Sovereignty and Children's Day, and just like every other year, the streets of Istanbul were teeming with people partaking in the celebrations or just regular people living their day-to-day lives. Everything looked completely normal until just after noon, around 12:49 p.m. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake with a shallow depth of 10 kilometers, according to the United States Geology Survey, struck just some 40 kilometers south of Istanbul. Its epicenter deep beneath the Sea of Marmara. The tremors were felt in several neighboring provinces, even as far as Ankara, some 275 miles away. The ground suddenly began to tremble underneath people's feet. Buildings shook, shelves toppled, as thousands, maybe even millions, fled the walls of their homes and scrambled outside into the streets, terrified for their lives. Others, remembering the drills they'd been taught, huddled under tables. For about 13 long seconds, the tremors continued, throwing the city into pandemonium. Petrified, many residents jumped out of buildings. Thankfully, when the quaking stopped, no lives had been lost. But as per the latest reports, 236 Istanbul residents were injured, mostly from leaping out of heights, with around 123 more receiving treatments for their wounds across other parts of Turkey. While Turkey's biggest city might have been let off the hook quite easily when it came to human resources, Istanbul paid dearly with its infrastructure. At least 6,539 buildings were damaged, and some mobile network providers were disrupted in parts of Istanbul, with 80% of the damage occurring on the European side of the city. iPhones went completely out of service, with only Androids just pinging after the tremors stopped. And the aftershocks? By the 25th of April, 260 aftershocks were recorded, the strongest of them measuring at 5.9 magnitude. The earthquake also triggered a small tsunami, reaching maximum heights of 6 centimeters at Erdek, 4 at Esenkoy, and 3 centimeters at Silivri. In response, at least 3,597 personnel were deployed to the Marmara region, including an additional 1,443 in Istanbul, along with 250 vehicles and 18 rescue dogs. Turkey's education minister Yusuf Tekin announced the closure of schools from 24 to 25th of April in Istanbul and Tekirdağ. Also, parks in Fatih and several mosques, including the Sizade Mosque, were converted to overnight shelters. Over 100,000 people slept in designated shelters overnight due to the earthquake. Before the quake struck, experts had been giving warnings for years that Istanbul was vulnerable, but no one had expected the situation to escalate so quickly. Many buildings were believed to be somewhat resistant to the more moderate quakes. Yet the April 2025 earthquake revealed shocking vulnerabilities, as thousands of structures sustained heavy damages that were far more than initial risk assessments suggested. Despite years of prep drills after previous disasters, emergency services were overwhelmed. Communication services broke down, leaving millions without access to emergency information. The result? Widespread panic among residents that led to hundreds of avoidable injuries. The difference between expectation and reality became painfully clear. Istanbul's infrastructure, public preparedness, and emergency responses were far weaker than officials and the public believed. This isn't the first time Turkey is being rocked by an earthquake. On February 6, 2023, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck Turkey and Syria. The epicenter was close to the Syrian border. More than 56,000 lives were lost and hundreds of thousands more people were displaced. And it almost happened again. So what really went wrong in Istanbul? Considering this isn't Turkey's first earthquake, and that last one was far worse than this, how come authorities were caught unawares once again? Well, for one, the major cause of this earthquake is Istanbul's dangerous proximity to the North Anatolian Fault. But what exactly is a fault? In simple terms, a fault is a fracture in the Earth's crust along which there's been a significant displacement of rock masses relative to each other. These fractures could range anything from a few millimeters to thousands of kilometers and can be either active or inactive. Unfortunately, the North Anatolian Fault is highly active and has a terrible history of producing some of the most devastating earthquakes ever known to mankind. For example, the 1939 Erzincan and 1999 Izmit tragedies, both of which resulted in a massive loss of life. For a bit of gory lore, the 1939 Erzincan tremor killed more than 32,000 people, while the 1999 earthquake in Izmit killed more than 17,000 people. So how do these faults cause earthquakes? It's pretty clear-cut. A sudden movement across a fault line and an earthquake follows. But while Turkish authorities cannot just move or evacuate Istanbul's 16 million inhabitants to another location, they could have done better with the city's infrastructural development. In the 1960s, Istanbul experienced a massive burst of growth, during which building codes were not followed. Too many buildings went up, too quickly. The result? A city that today has become left very vulnerable. Those seismic codes had already been put in place since the 1940s, but because of rapid urbanization, they were never really followed. A lack of rigorous enforcement of laws meant that many developers either made substandard structures or deviated from approved designs. The Turkish government introduced amnesty programs that allowed developers to pay fines instead of upgrading their buildings, thereby tacitly supporting negligence. Many of the older buildings in Turkey lack essential reinforcements like steel, making them vulnerable to pancaking or the collapse of one story onto the one beneath it. Still, we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Turkish government has actually put in efforts towards retrofitting public buildings. Think schools, hospitals, and government offices. But progress has been slow, and the sheer scale of the problem is daunting. The majority of Istanbul's buildings are private homes and apartment blocks, and they're often left out of these programs, as many times the owners just don't want to be bothered. Also, it's really important to note that Istanbul is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, and in many neighborhoods, buildings are packed tightly together, leaving little room for evacuations or emergency response. Designated assembly zones were inadequate, with many of them having been sold off to private development. When the earthquake hit, many people couldn't find open spaces, and the few parks and squares available were quickly overwhelmed. In some areas, narrow streets made it almost impossible for emergency vehicles to get through. But apart from the natural and structural forces behind this earthquake's damage, panic was the major driving factor behind Wednesday's horrors. Considering Turkey's relationship and history with earthquakes, you'd expect the people to be experienced and ready for situations like this. But things were quite different from that on Wednesday. The bulk of the recorded injuries weren't caused by the falling debris, but rather by the people rushing to escape. Fear and confusion led to many injurious falls, and maybe one can't blame them too much. As mentioned earlier, after the initial earthquake, there were multiple aftershocks, which must have been piled upon the people's fears. We also have to bear in mind the trauma etched in the residents' minds from similar events in the past. Now that we have all the cold, hard facts, the next question is, was there anything the Turkish could have done to mitigate the effects of this earthquake? Yes, there was no recorded loss of life, but for all we know, Wednesday's events might just have been the precursor to something bigger. And in that case, we need to know what could be done in preparation for what's coming. The bitter truth remains. The tectonic movements along the north that caused the earthquake couldn't have been prevented, but the Turkish government could have done a lot more to at least reduce the massive infrastructural damage. For one, those seismic codes shouldn't have ever been ignored. But the mistakes have already been made, and that's all in the past now. The next best line of action would be to update and enforce building codes on any developers trying to put up new structures. The focus now should be more on preparing Istanbul and the rest of Turkey for another possible quake. And in that case, despite the high costs, retrofitting older buildings is a must, whether the owners are excited about it or not. Incentives, subsidies, or low-interest loans could be used to help support them in strengthening their homes. And where the structures are too dangerous to be left alone, they should be replaced with newer, safer buildings, built with seismic codes in mind. Japan and Chile are some textbook examples Turkey could model after, as their adherence to strict building codes have significantly reduced the risk of collapse, saving countless lives during earthquakes. Also, city planners could do with designing neighborhoods with space in mind. Wider streets, parks, plazas. These should become non-negotiables. They're not just fun spots. They could prove to be serious lifesavers in the case of emergencies. But of course, we can't leave out the people themselves. The main cause of injuries during the April earthquake was people's fear. Faced with the possibility of losing their lives, anyone would be afraid. But moving forward, they should be taught what to do with that fear. People need to be educated. Earthquake drills in schools, workplaces, and even randomly in communities have become a regular fixture. Armed with the right knowledge, people would be able to react calmly, safely, and logically when the ground begins to shake, and not attempt to jump out of high-rise buildings. Finally, Turkish authorities could look to Japan and Mexico for inspiration, to intensify their efforts at providing earthquake early warning systems that could give people precious seconds to take cover or stop trains and elevators. Istanbul might have been let off the hook a bit easily this time. The damage was, you could say, minimal, and best of all, no lives were lost. But from experts' indication, this might not be the last earthquake the city will face. And the next time, the fate of its inhabitants would depend on way more than luck, but rather the steps taken by the Turkish authorities to prepare themselves. But what did you think of all that? Was this a truly unavoidable incident? Let us know in the comments, and remember to leave your likes and subscribe too.